This has been a Hampton County story. This has been a Hampton County scandal.
A jury found the disgraced South Carolina attorney guilty of murdering his wife and his youngest son.
This has been the downfall of a family dynasty.
Today is not the end. It's the next step in a long road to justice for every person who has been victimized by Alex Murdaugh.
Justice for Stephen Smith, Alex.
Stephen Smith was another body in this orbit of the Murdaugh family.
Stephen was a gay young man in the low country of South Carolina. That is courageous in and of itself.
I can't imagine the terror he was in that night.
In the early morning hours of July 8, 2015, 19-year-old Stephen Smith was found dead in the middle of a rural road.
There was an autopsy that basically said it's a hit and run.
There was no vehicle debris, no broken headlight, paint scrapes or anything.
You never believed it?
No, not at all. He never would have been walking in that road, not voluntarily.
Do you believe Stephen was murdered?
I do.
An investigation of some sort took place that led nowhere. And then it went cold.
I wanted a second opinion.
Sandy Smith is unique in this whole story. She doesn't know who killed her son. She doesn't know why.
People in town really believed that it was connected to the Murdaughs in some way. The name Buster Murdaugh kept coming up.
I never had anything to do with his murder, and I never had anything to do with him on a physical level of any regard.
The rumors also suggest a cover-up.
We are aware of no evidence today that would suggest that any Murdaugh played any role in Stephen Smith's death or played any role in trying to cover up the investigation into his death.
All I want is peace and knowing what happened to my son. He's my world, and I'm gonna fight to the end.
This is a woman that has fought this battle alone since 2015, screaming as loud as she could with not a lot of people listening.
CBS News confirming that the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division is now investigating Stephen Smith's death as a homicide.
The Murdaugh case brought Stephen's cold case to life.
Somehow, some way in the Murdaugh murder investigation, a new thread was opened up into Stephen Smith.
Our primary function right now is to have that body exhumed, have a true independent set of eyes look at it and tell us once and for all what really happened to Stephen Smith.
The gash was from part of this eyebrow across here. The injuries can tell us so much about what happened.
And in this case, they did.
They did.
Set the scene for me on July 8th, 2015, here.
Stephen was somewhat right here in the road.
How confident are you that you know what happened to Stephen Smith that night?
I'm as close to a degree of scientific certainty as I've ever felt.
Like his mother, Sandy, Stephen Smith was born a fighter.
He was a preemie. He weighed 2 pounds, 12 ounces.
A twin?
Yeah, twin.
Born at 27 weeks with his sister, Stephanie, Sandy says Stephen couldn't breathe on his own. After several months, she was told he might not make it, and she was finally allowed to hold her baby for the first time.
How was that moment?
Oh my gosh, it was amazing. It was supposed to be my goodbye. But he started breathing on his own.
Because he felt you?
Yeah, that's why he was my heart.
Sandy never dreamed she'd one day be fighting for answers in her son's death.
How would you describe the journey that you've been on for justice?
It's been a hard journey, just living day by day and fighting day by day.
On July 8, 2015, Stephen was found dead on a country road in Hampton County, the same county where 3 generations of Murdaugh men had held the top prosecutor job for nearly a century. The Murdaughs still loomed large over small-town life.
Alec Murdaugh coached Stephen's baseball team at one point?
When they were little. I think Stephen was like 7 or 8.
Stephen and Stephanie were also classmates of Murdaugh's older son, Buster, before Stephen went to nursing school with dreams of one day becoming a doctor.
He wanted to be a doctor, but it was more expensive, so he just started with nursing school. He loved dealing with medicine, and he just loved it.
You must have been so proud.
Oh, I was.
But instead, Sandy says those dreams were buried with her son.
You decided to bury him in his scrubs?
Scrubs, Dr. Stephen Smith. He had everything he needed in his pockets. He had a stethoscope and everything he needed.
Stephen had just completed a semester of school and was taking summer classes, shuttling back and forth between his parents who lived apart. He had visited Sandy a week before he was killed.
A storm started brewing. I told him that he needed to hurry up and get back to his dad's house. So when he made it, he texts me and says, "I made it safe, Mom. Mama, I love you."
Sandy says those were Stephen's last words to her. Days later, she would hear the news that would alter the course of her life.
July 8th, I was on my way to work, and I was listening to a local radio station, and I heard that they had found a body.
Sandy called her daughter Stephanie right away.
She said, "Mama, did Stephen stay with you last night? Because he didn't come home last night." Then my stomach dropped, and I knew it was him.
Sandy says Stephen's father, Joel, went to the sheriff's office for confirmation that it was Stephen. That's when she says they received a call.
Well, I was on the phone with Joel the whole time while we were waiting for the sheriff to come out, and that's when Joel asked me to hold on because Randy Murdaugh was calling.
Randy Murdaugh is Alec Murdaugh's older brother and had been representing Joel Smith in a workers' comp case, but now he was calling about Stephen.
When Joel got back on the phone, he said Randy had asked if that was our Stephen and that he wanted to help pro bono.
Did you think it was strange that Randy offered to help pro bono?
Well, I did, but Joel thought it was a nice gesture.
Later that morning, Sandy says she was surprised again as she drove past the scene where Stephen's body had reportedly been found.
There was Alex and Randy standing on the opposite side of the road.
Murdaugh.
A few minutes later, Sandy says Randy Murdaugh called again.
And asked if that was me that passed by. He said, "I wish you'd have stopped so I could have met you."
Randy Murdaugh declined our request for an interview, but through his attorney, he provided a written statement of 48 hours in which he said, quote, "I was not aware of Stephen's death until Joel told me. They wanted my involvement and I contacted law enforcement on their behalf." Murdaugh said he went to the scene with a private investigator after meeting with Joel and Stephanie, adding, quote, "Claims that I visited the scene of Stephen's death with my brother Alec are false." Joel Smith passed away 3 months after Stephen. But Stephanie and Sandy told us they never asked the Murdaughs for help. And there were other things about Stephen's case that didn't sit well with Sandy from the moment the sheriff confirmed the body was Stephen's. At first, he told them Stephen had been shot.
What were you thinking?
Who would shoot him? It made no sense. I lost it then. I left my job and just drove back to Hampton, and we just mourned together. We just couldn't understand why or who. It was just the biggest shock of our life.
Within hours, Stephen's cause of death was suddenly changed to a hit and run.
Toward the evening time, we were contacted by the sheriff's office. After his autopsy, there was not any type of bullet or bullet fragment found in his head. Because his body was in the roadway, it was being ruled a hit and run.
Retired South Carolina Highway Patrol Lieutenant Thomas Moore was the on-scene supervisor.
I was told that the medical examiner made that ruling, and I reached out to her. It became a little bit heated. Give me an answer medically that would lead you to believe he was hit by a car. There was no medical reason.
Did you see any signs of a hit and run?
No, ma'am, none. Any type of debris, any kind of glass, car parts, piece of plastic, anything that looks like it may be related to a vehicle.
Also unusual for a hit and run, Stephen's clothing was intact and his shoes, which were loosely tied, were still on.
Generally, clothes are torn or unraveled, and shoes have come off.
And Stephen's car keys and cell phone were in his front pocket unharmed. And Moore says Stephen's body appeared staged.
His body was laying like it had been placed in a certain position, not what you would typically see, and it looked like somebody had hit him in the head with some kind of object.
Meanwhile, Stephen's wallet was still in his car, which investigators found 3 miles away, with the doors locked and the gas cap hanging open.
In all the years I've worked, a car sitting on the side of the road with the gas cap off is not normal. I thought it was staged, like his body was staged in the roadway.
Sandy says she wondered if Stephen might have been the victim of a hate crime.
Did you think that it was possibly because of his sexuality?
I did think that. I know he was teased a lot at school, but he still held his head high.
But Sandy says in the days leading up to his death, Stephen was worried about his safety. He'd called his sister Stephanie for help the day before he was killed.
Stephanie said the battery cable was loosened on his car, so she had met him and then she tightened the battery cable. And she asked him to get out the car and help her, and he said, "No, I'm not getting out."
Like he was scared.
Right.
But he never said why. Despite what Lieutenant Moore felt were suspicious circumstances, he says once Stephen's death was ruled a hit and run, it became the Highway Patrol's job to solve the case, instead of the Hampton County Sheriff's Office or SLED, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division.
I felt like the case, for lack of a better word, was being pawned off on us. No matter what we said, we were going to be the ones investigating that case. As we were getting started, certain names started coming up.
Which names?
Murdaugh.
Soon after Stephen Smith was killed, Hampton County Guardian managing editor Michael DeWitt says he began hearing persistent rumors all over town.
What are the rumors?
That at least one Murdaugh child was in a vehicle with other boys, and allegedly somebody in the vehicle struck the young man with the baseball bat and killed him.
Sandy says those same rumors hit her doorstep as soon as Stephen's body was taken for an autopsy.
It made no sense to me.
At any point, did you think that someone in the Murdaugh family was involved?
Well, the longer it went on, the more I was asking myself questions. But I just couldn't find the connection. Powerful family, and then you got Stephen, who was just Stephen.
Sandy couldn't help but think back to her last conversation with Stephen a week before he was killed.
Somebody was messaging him a lot. He told me that he was going deep sea fishing, and he said Key West. And I said, "Well, who are you going with?" He said, "Well, I can't tell you."
Did that make you pause?
Yeah, he said, "You'd be surprised." It's kind of like a prominent person. And then all I could say was, "Well, I hope you have fun."
Sandy says Stephen had become more secretive the last couple weeks, but it never crossed her mind he might be talking about a Murdaugh.
The original rumor was that Stephen was planning to go away with Buster Murdaugh and his family, that they were together romantically.
Liz Farrell is the writer and co-host of the Murdaugh Murders podcast.
There's no evidence of that we know of.
And 48 Hours found no evidence to support the rumors. Retired Highway Patrol Lieutenant Thomas Moore says the mere mention of the Murdaughs made it difficult to get help from local agencies.
We tried to hand that case file over to the sheriff's office, and they physically would not take it from our hand.
The Murdaugh name was still very powerful, very well connected in law enforcement, and the rumors suggested, well, the local cops aren't going to dig into it.
Instead, the case was handled solely by the Highway Patrol's multidisciplinary accident investigation team called MATE, which specializes in complex vehicle crashes.
The MATE team was from out of town, and we wanted outside eyes involved in this.
The Murdaugh name appears dozens of times in MATE's 2015 case file, which we obtained through a Freedom of Information request. In his audio notes, Corporal Michael Duncan makes it clear he doesn't think Stephen's death is a hit and run.
There is no body trauma other than to the head area. It does not appear to be, in my opinion, struck by a vehicle.
Another investigator, Todd Proctor, goes further.
Typically, you don't see the highway patrol working a murder, and that's what this is.
He hints at a conflict of interest for the local sheriff's department.
There's a reason why Hampton County Sheriff's Department is not handling this, and I'll leave it at that.
In this interview with Proctor, local teen Taylor Dobson shares a detailed version of that story about several young men in a truck.
I heard that these 2, maybe 3 young men were in a vehicle. They were riding down 601, saw the car on the side of the road. I guess saw the boy walking. They turned back around, then stuck something out the window.
He offers a name reluctantly.
He goes by Buster Murdaugh.
Dobson says he grew up with Buster.
Kinda out of character to who I knew. It was just strictly hearsay from all I know.
Proctor reassures him the Murdaughs are already aware authorities want to speak with Buster.
They know that he's on our radar. Matter of fact, I talked to one of their guys yesterday and told him, I'm gonna talk to Buster here soon, and they said, okay, that's fine.
But according to the case file, a call to Buster Murdaugh in October 2015 was never returned. And in December, following a front-page story in the Hampton County Guardian, Mate received a tip called in at the direction of Randy Murdaugh, Buster's uncle. A man named Daryl Williams called a Hampton police officer to report the tip, which involved 2 teens, Sean Connolly and Patrick Wilson. In a recorded phone call, the officer relays to Corporal Duncan what Williams told him.
Daryl called me and he said, Patrick, come over here to the house. He said that Sean Connolly was drunk and hit something. He went back the next day to see what it was he had hit, and he seen a lot of police out there. Patrick was crying, telling him, and after he got finished telling the story, he walked outside his house and threw up.
Did he go into any detail about how it happened?
Supposedly, he had fixed his mirror, one of the mirrors up on the truck.
The side mirror story matched Stephen's original death certificate. For reasons that are unclear, there is no record of Duncan or Proctor ever speaking to Connolly or Wilson. Wilson had no comment to 48 Hours. Messages to the Hampton County Sheriff's Office, Williams, and Connolly have not been answered. Sandy Smith says she asked Sean Connolly point blank if he killed Stephen.
And he said?
He said, no, ma'am, I did not. I give you my word, I promise you, I never killed your son.
Do you believe him?
Yeah.
If he lied to you, if that turns out to be the case.
It won't be the first time I'm lied to, but if you did it, you need to pay.
In September 2016, fed up with what she calls the lack of an investigation, Sandy began a letter-writing campaign that included the FBI.
What did your letter say?
I was just letting them know that my son was murdered and there's no progress being done, and I think it had something to do with the Murdaugh family, and please help. Just please help me.
Sandy also told the FBI she believed someone was deliberately trying to derail the investigation.
Did you ever get a response from the FBI?
I did, and I had 2 agents come to my house.
She asked them to unlock Stephen's phone, and they did.
Do you know if anyone actually was able to read Stephen's text messages or see where he might have been based on cell phone evidence?
What I heard from the FBI agent, there was a lot of interesting information in the phone that needed to be looked at.
But she says that didn't prompt local or state authorities to pursue the case further.
There's something in that phone that nobody wants out there.
By late 2016, the investigation into Stephen Smith's death went cold.
What do you think it took for Stephen's case to finally get the attention it deserves, that you wanted?
Somebody else had to die.
What information do you think was found on Stephen's phone? Chat now on Facebook and X.
The murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh in June of 2021 caused a seismic shift in small-town Hampton and gave Sandy Smith a lifeline she desperately needed.
It took this to get Stephen's name back out there so somebody would start paying attention.
In a strange twist of fate, while investigating the murders of Paula Maggie Murdaugh, SLED announced it had stumbled on a new lead in Stephen's death and would be taking over the case. They did not say what that evidence was.
It seems like all roads lead to the Murdaugh family around here.
Yes.
Is that coincidence, or is there a reason for that?
Around here, it's natural.
It would be another 2 years while authorities focused on getting a conviction against Alec Murdaugh, but Sandy now has a high-octane legal team in her corner.
After 8 years of waiting for your turn, Sandy Smith finally just had enough.
Ronnie and I are like arsonists. We started the fire.
Ronnie Richter and Eric Bland are representing Sandy pro bono.
Our sole goal was to rekindle the interest in Stephen's death.
And they turned up the heat on SLED. In March of 2023, SLED publicly acknowledged it was treating Stephen's case as a homicide. The same week, Buster Murdaugh released a statement through his father's attorney saying, quote, "These baseless rumors of my involvement with Stephen and his death are false. I unequivocally deny any involvement in his death, and my heart goes out to the Smith family."
Those words are now in cement. I take him at his word that he had nothing at all to do with Stephen's death.
Rather than old rumors, Bland and Richter say they're focusing on a new investigation made possible by $130,000 in GoFundMe donations from Sandy supporters.
The resources were made available for us to do some private investigative work that's going to start with hiring a pathology team.
They were also able to have Stephen's body exhumed, something Sandy had wanted for years.
Our primary function right now is to have a true independent set of eyes look at it and tell us once and for all what really happened to Stephen Smith.
In April of 2023, Dr. Michelle Dupree, a former investigator and forensic pathologist who's performed more than 3,000 autopsies, oversaw the examination of Stephen's body.
The injuries can tell us so much about what happened.
And in this case, they did.
They did.
Dupree says the autopsy confirmed Stephen died from a single blow to his forehead, severely fracturing his skull.
That's a big gash.
That's 7.5 inches almost. There would be another gash in this posterior area from hitting the pavement so hard.
It literally split his skull.
And split his skull.
They were also able to put to rest some rumors, including the one that Stephen had been beaten with a baseball bat.
It wasn't a baseball bat.
No. Those type of injuries would cause something that we call pattern injuries, and we don't see that here. This is a linear fracture, as well as this is here.
Just as important as what they found, Dupree says, is what they didn't find.
We didn't find fractures of any part of the body except for the head. There was a little road rash, which you would expect.
Any signs of a struggle?
No.
Any signs of a beating?
No.
Any injuries below his head other than the road rash?
None whatsoever.
She says that eliminates the possibility Stephen was hit by a car head-on. Dupree says the findings also refute early theories that Stephen's body might have been staged.
Were you able to determine whether Stephen was struck and fell, or he might have been struck and then placed there?
We don't believe that he was placed there. We believe that whatever happened right there.
Dr. Kenny Kinsey agrees.
You think he was killed right here?
Right there.
A crime scene expert and star prosecution witness in the Murdaugh murder trial, Kinsey worked with Dupree to analyze Stephen's case. He says the evidence at the scene is clear.
That's a massive amount of blood, and if he had that kind of injury somewhere else, it wouldn't be that uniform.
Due to their sensitive nature, we created versions of the crime scene photos in which the blood and body are shown as graphics.
The quantity of blood, the direction of the flow in the road, and then the direction of all the blood on his person led me to the only conclusion.
Kinsey's convinced an object attached to a vehicle traveling at high speed caused the single fatal blow to Stephen's head.
But whatever hit him was fast and it was large.
So a hit and run, but an atypical hit and run.
Yeah, very atypical.
A hit and run with no vehicle debris at the scene. It's a conclusion no one was expecting.
How confident are you that you know what happened to Stephen Smith that night?
I'm as close to a degree of scientific certainty as I've ever felt.
What no one can say with certainty is whether Stephen's death was accidental or not. But still, Richter points out, he was left there to die.
Someone left him in that condition in the roadway, and that is a very serious felony.
Stephen's body was found about 3 miles from his car. Kinsey tried to retrace his steps.
I wanted to walk every possible path that Mr. Smith may have taken.
Stephen's family has always insisted if Stephen had car trouble, he would have felt safer walking through the woods.
So where was Stephen's car?
Stephen's car was located, if you look at this gate here, it was not grown up then. You could access that gate, but in this area, really close to the woods.
But to cut through the woods, Stephen would have had to scale a fence that was 8 feet tall.
And from what I understand from interviewing neighbors, it's been there for well over a decade.
Kinsey theorizes Stephen was walking along the road, trying to flag someone down for help.
He is walking this direction in the lane facing traffic. Whatever was attached to the vehicle or hanging off of the vehicle, whenever it struck Stephen, he went down in this area, somewhat on this line here. The vehicle that struck Stephen was coming toward him, just like that vehicle in the photograph.
Like this?
Yes, going that direction.
Kinsey says the evidence suggests the driver saw something in the road and changed lanes.
And sometime before it struck Stephen, I believe it changed into the oncoming lane.
That's when he says an object from the passenger side struck Stephen.
What kind of object could it be?
It could be anything. It could be a ladder hanging off the back of a work truck. It could be a extended side mirror, the metal type that you see on some farm vehicles or some larger vehicles.
That scenario matches up with the tip from 2015 involving Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly, which Kinsey calls plausible.
That certainly would be possible. That would be one of the places I would start.
SLED has kept its investigation close to the vest, but Bland and Richter say a grand jury was impaneled and is issuing subpoenas.
They're honing in on specific individuals, and I think there's about 5 or less that SLED believes has information regarding Stephen's death.
We don't know who those individuals are. In an interview on Fox Nation in August of 2023, Buster Murdaugh again denied the rumors of his involvement.
I never had anything to do with his murder, and I never had anything to do with him on a physical level of any regard.
He also provided an alibi.
The night Stephen was killed, I was at our Edisto Beach house.
With your family?
With my mom and my brother.
Sandy's team says it's turned over all of its findings to SLED, but Kinsey says it's still going to take someone coming forward.
Somebody knows.
Oh, they know. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think Stephen's death was an accident or intentional? See a timeline of the case at 48hours.com.
As a grand jury zeroes in on potential suspects in Stephen Smith's death, the legal wrangling hasn't slowed down for Alec Murdaugh.
You've got local charges, you've got state charges. The legal civil cases are going to go on for years.
On November 17th, 2023,
I am guilty, and yes, sir.
Murdaugh agreed to a plea deal encompassing all of the state financial charges he faced for defrauding and stealing millions from clients and law partners. He had previously pleaded guilty to 22 federal conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering charges.
Alex preyed on the vulnerable whom he also thought would never figure out his schemes.
Correct. It's people that are at the worst times of their lives where you need a lawyer to be the best for you, not the worst for you.
Perhaps none more so than Elena and Hannah Plyler, who are now represented by Bland and Richter.
Who were the Plylers?
They were 2 young girls from Colombia.
They were just 12 and 8 when they survived a deadly crash due to a faulty tire that killed their mother and 14-year-old brother in 2005 and became the youngest of the financial victims to whom Murdaugh admitted he lied and stole from when questioned at his murder trial.
What loss did they suffer? Who died?
Their mother did.
He only mentioned your mom.
Yeah, that bothered me. Because you don't remember that a 14-year-old was killed in that wreck. Alec got a very good paycheck off of my brother's death.
Both women are now mothers, and Elena is a detective with the Lexington County Sheriff's Office.
Since all of this has come out, there's a lot of pain that's still there.
Elena was old enough to remember the details of the last road trip she and her sister would ever take with their mom and brother.
My brother and I had gotten into an argument. I wanted to start sitting in the front seat. So we fought about it, and finally Mom was like, you know what? Justin's gonna ride on the way to Columbia, and on the way back home, Elena gets to ride up front. And I was so happy.
Elena and Hannah, who were still sitting in the back seat, survived the crash.
So you must think about that all the time.
I do. I actually had a lot of guilt for several years.
That guilt is something she says she's learned to let go as she recounts her and her little sister's harrowing survival.
We hadn't been on the road too long. Hannah was sleeping, and I was listening to Usher. And I remember Mom saying, Lena, you awake? And so I remember pulling my headphones down and said, yeah, Mom. Within seconds, I heard this loud pop. And then I immediately heard my mom scream. I looked out the window, and my Usher CD was spinning on a tree limb.
Their mother, Angela, and brother, Justin, died instantly. Elena realized she was trapped and couldn't move and had to send Hannah for help.
I said, I need you to get out of the car, and I need you to go to the top of the hill to the interstate.
And you're only 12.
I'm 12, right. So many things could have went worse.
8-year-old Hannah climbed up to the interstate.
There was an 18-wheeler, and I was able to flag him down. And I think by that point, an ambulance came in, and they had taken me to the hospital.
Elena waited alone until a fire rescue team arrived and cut her out of the wreckage. She watched as they removed her mother and brother.
And so I watched them put them in a black body bag.
She was then airlifted to a hospital and would need numerous surgeries.
What was the moment like when you were able to see each other again after that?
I remember it. I remember hugging her and thanking her for not dying, for not leaving me. And then from there, I was just in the hospital bed with you. You couldn't keep us apart.
The sisters say they were passed around to live with family members.
We didn't have a bedroom.
You just had each other.
Just each other. Yeah. We lived at a little plastic bin.
When a family friend referred the Plylers to Alec Murdaugh, he promised to change all of that.
Do you remember the first time you met Alec Murdaugh?
Yeah. I remember when he walked in, he seemed really arrogant, like a bulldog. Just tall, almost intimidating in a sense. He told us, they took your family from you, and we're going to make this right. They're going to pay.
To two young girls who had lost everything, Murdaugh seemed larger than life.
I always felt at peace when I got to talk to Alec. People listened to him. You could tell there was a lot of control there.
How did he earn your trust?
Really, with his words. He was a smooth talker, and he made you feel special.
But once the case settled, the special treatment stopped.
He pretty much checked out. He had explained that the case had settled. We won big money.
Elenia's case settled for $4.7 million. You know, Hannah's for right at $3 million. That money was then entrusted to Russell Lafitte.
Lafitte was the CEO of Palmetto State Bank in Hampton and a close friend of Murdaugh, who'd handpicked Lafitte to manage the funds as conservator until the girls turned 18.
So these two very wealthy, prominent men basically helped themselves to these kids' piggy bank.
Any money they needed had to be approved by Lafitte and a judge.
Even if it was $1, we had to have a receipt for it.
When you and Eric took on their case, what did you discover?
Russell was making loans to Alex. Alex would be overdrawn $50,000, $100,000, $300,000 in his personal account, and he needed money to cover those shorts.
Richter says that at Murdaugh's direction, Lafitte transferred nearly $1.5 million from the Plylers' money to Alec Murdaugh and himself.
When it came time for these young ladies to turn 18, the money was supposed to be there. So Alex had to go out and steal new money from different clients and put that money back.
Murdaugh was never charged for Hannah and Elena's case, but Lafitte was convicted on federal charges for his role.
But still, there's that toll of how do you trust going forward? People were put in a position of trust on their behalf when they were just children. And then to learn as an adult that the entire time they saw you as nothing more than a checkbook.
While the Plylers can begin to heal, Sandy Smith still waits for her day of reckoning.
All this sweeping drama, there's answers and there's closure for everybody else, but not for Sandy Smith. It's time to put the spotlight on Stephen Smith.
Months after his blockbuster trial,
Alec Murdaugh!
Verdict, guilty.
Convicted double murderer Alec Murdaugh and the crime of the century are still Hampton's biggest attractions.
Almost every day somebody's coming by taking a picture of the law firm or riding out to Moselle taking pictures. They just can't get enough.
The Murdaugh craze was on full display at an auction for the family's personal items from their Moselle property. The infamous leather couch set where Alec testified he took a cat nap while his wife and son were murdered sold for $30,000. And Maggie's dog, Bubba, who helped prosecutors prove Alec was actually at the crime scene, has become a local folk hero.
If that rambunctious yellow lab hadn't have been doing what labs like to do, chase birds, we might not have solved this case and we might not have gotten a conviction.
Alec's voice calling Bubba was caught in the background of phone video Paul took minutes before he was killed.
Bubba and the other dogs at the kennels, they were witnesses to a very horrific event.
Bubba now lives a quiet life with the Murdaugh's housekeeper. Meanwhile, Alec Murdaugh is serving 2 life terms in a maximum security prison.
Do you think Alec Murdaugh still thinks he can try to play the system?
100%.
Now, Murdaugh's attorneys are hoping their latest motion will be a get-out-of-jail-free card.
We're focused on getting him a new trial.
In September 2023, Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin announced their motion for a new trial based on allegations of jury tampering by the Colleton County Clerk of Court, Becky Hill.
What we had filed today, supported by sworn testimony of jurors, is that the Clerk of Court had improper private communications with the jurors.
The state versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh defendant.
They argued that Hill violated Murdaugh's right to a fair trial when she allegedly told jurors not to be fooled by his testimony and to watch his body language as Alec was about to take the stand.
I'm Alec Murdaugh.
In a signed affidavit, Hill denies all of the defense allegations, and voluntary statements from a majority of the jury support Hill's account. Richter and Bland say even a new trial can save Alec Murdaugh.
If the murder conviction's overturned, then you have the financial crimes.
So, yes, there's a theoretical universe in which Alex Murdaugh could see the sun again, but it's theoretical only.
It's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
It's futile.
If you were to write a made-for-TV Southern legal drama, you couldn't have done a better job than this.
DeWitt writes about it in his book, The Fall of the House of Murdaugh, which he ends with Stephen Smith.
It's kind of interesting and tragic that the oldest story remains unsolved. Solving his murder, I think this will be the end of this sweeping saga.
As SLED continues its investigation of the Smith case behind closed doors, what investigators found after the Murdaugh murders remains the subject of intense speculation.
Do you have any idea what the new evidence that may be presented to the grand jury is?
No, I do know that SLED has Stephen's phone. I know that they have Stephen's tablet.
Could Stephen's phone reveal the identity of the prominent person with whom he told Sandy he'd planned to go deep-sea fishing?
That'll be interesting what SLED has found out and what the grand jury is going to determine whether the person that he was going to go away with, deep-sea fishing, had anything to do with his death or has knowledge of his death.
How has this fight for justice been?
Oh, it has been a long road, but it's worth it.
Sandy is keeping the faith and keeping Stephen's memory alive. She recently established a college scholarship in his name.
We are starting this scholarship fund so other children won't have it as hard as Stephen did.
And she's offering a $30,000 reward for information leading to an arrest.
And now it's your turn that if you know something, that you say something.
What do you miss most about Stephen?
I miss everything about him.
What do you think Stephen would think of your fight where we are today in his case?
He said, "Oh, Mama, you would do that for me?" Yep, I would. Over and over.
CBS next Saturday. 48 Hours brings you back-to-back episodes all summer long. Next week, killer creatures.
This man was murdered, and they blamed it on alligators.
Someone being killed by a snake is not something that happens every day.
48 Hours primetime double feature. Next Saturday on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
This is Post-Mortem. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Green. If you're a fan of 48 Hours, you have definitely heard about the Murdaughs, the prominent, wealthy family from Hampton County, South Carolina. In 2023, Alex Murdaugh was found guilty of murdering his wife, Maggie, and his younger son, Paul. But attention to those murders also ignited a new investigation into the 2015 mysterious death of Stephen Smith, a 19-year-old whose death was rumored to be connected to the Murdaughs. So I am joined today by CBS News national correspondent Nikki Battiste and producer Gayane Keshishyan Mendez to discuss their episode, Stephen Smith, A Death in Murdaugh Country, which originally aired November 25th, 2023. Thank you so much for joining us.
So good to be here, Anne-Marie.
Thanks for having us, Anne-Marie.
Let's listen to a recap of the episode.
When Stephen Smith was found dead on a country road on July 8th, 2015, his mother Sandy was convinced it was no accident.
Do you believe Stephen was murdered?
I do.
The medical examiner ruled it a hit and run, but retired South Carolina Highway Patrol Lieutenant Thomas Moore says the scene told a different story.
Did you see any signs of a hit and run?
No, ma'am. None. Any type of debris, any kind of glass, car parts.
Stephen's car was 3 miles away.
I thought it was staged, like his body was staged in the roadway. It looked like somebody had hit him in the head with some kind of object.
Early on, rumors began to swirl that the Murdaughs were somehow involved. The Murdaugh name comes up dozens of times in the case file. By late 2016, the case went cold.
All I want is peace and knowing what happened to my son.
In June of 2021, the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh reignited interest in Stephen Smith's case.
Somehow, some way in the Murdaugh murder investigation, a new thread was opened up into Stephen Smith.
Attorneys Ronnie Richter and Eric Bland are now helping Sandy Smith find answers.
We are aware of no evidence today that would suggest that any Murdaugh played any role in Stephen Smith's death.
Our primary function right now is to have that body exhumed, have a true independent set of eyes look at it and tell us once and for all what really happened to Stephen Smith.
They brought on forensic pathologist Dr. Michelle Dupree, who says Stephen died from a single blow to his forehead.
Literally split his skull.
And split his skull.
And oddly, there were no injuries to his body to indicate he'd been hit head-on by a vehicle. Forensic crime scene expert Dr. Kenny Kinsey was also hired.
Stephen was somewhat right here.
Both experts believe Stephen died on the spot. Neither thinks the scene was staged.
There was a significant amount of blood at the scene, too much for him to have been killed someplace else and then transported there.
After examining all the evidence, they reached a surprising conclusion.
How confident are you that you know what happened to Stephen Smith that night?
I'm as close to a degree of scientific certainty as I've ever felt.
What happened to Stephen Smith is still under investigation. So we do want to preface that during this postmortem, we're going to be discussing the theories that investigators, lawyers, family members have about what could have happened to Stephen. Nikki, Gayane, what is known about Stephen Smith's relationship to the Murdaugh family, or is it all simply rumors and hearsay?
Anne-Marie, that's a really good question. There are very few facts that we know, but I can tell you, in many conversations with Sandy Smith, Stephen Smith's mother, she has told us that Stephen and Buster were classmates in school. Sandy also told us that Alec Murdaugh actually coached a baseball team Stephen was on when he was a little bit younger. But really, for the most part, this case, as has the Murdaugh case, has really been driven by rumors circulating, connecting Buster and Stephen.
Yeah, Gayane?
Stephen and his sister were actually trainers for the high school football team, of which Buster was a member. And Stephen also tutored Buster reportedly in some of his school subjects. Stephen was a really good student. So, those were all sort of connections that they had.
You also spoke to a podcaster, Liz Farrell. I think she's been on the Murdaugh case almost from the beginning. I mean, Nikki, you've been on from the beginning, but she has really sort of delved deep into it before I think it even became kind of a national story.
That's a really good point, because Liz Farrell was actually on the Stephen Smith case before the Murdaugh case became the Murdaugh case that we know about, the double murder.
So I want to play a little bit of her sound from the episode.
The original rumor was that Stephen was planning to go away with Buster Murdaugh and his family, that they were together romantically.
Liz Farrell is the writer and co-host of the Murdaugh Murders podcast.
There's no evidence of that we know of.
And 48 Hours found no evidence to support the rumors. Buster Murdaugh released a statement through his father's attorney saying, quote, "These baseless rumors of my involvement with Stephen and his death are false. I unequivocally deny any involvement in his death, and my heart goes out to the Smith family."
Those words are now in cement. I take him at his word that he had nothing at all to do with Stephen's death.
Now, your team made numerous requests for an interview with Buster Murdaugh, but he declined.
Yes. Buster Murdaugh eventually did do a television interview on Fox Nation. In it, he said, quote, "I never had anything to do with his murder, and I never had anything to do with him on a physical level of any regard." And he is, of course, there speaking about Stephen Smith, Anne-Marie.
In your reporting, though, for the broadcast, what did the people that you spoke to think about Stephen's possible connection to the Murdaughs?
This is interesting. I've worked on many cases, many criminal cases, as has Gayane and you. And I can tell you, I cannot remember a single case where it was so difficult to get anyone to talk to us on camera about any of the Murdaughs. And because Stephen's name was connected to them, at least by the rumor mill, they wouldn't talk about Stephen Smith either.
There definitely was a lot of curiosity around the case. When we were filming on the road where Stephen's body was found, a couple driving by stopped and wanted to know what we were doing. Wherever we were, people, whether or not it was grounded in, fact, had a lot of opinions about what had happened, and they spoke very authoritatively about it, but they didn't necessarily want to share those things. And, they weren't really things that we could substantiate or report.
What's interesting is people had a lot to say off camera. I remember being in a restaurant and two women were talking about what they thought about Stephen and Buster and what the connection might be. So people had a lot to say, but no one wanted to talk about it on camera. So much so that I had never experienced anything like it before.
What were they afraid of? Did they talk about that?
Some outright said they were afraid of the Murdaughs and the power that they had. And if they said anything that might upset the Murdaugh in any way, that somehow they'd be retaliated against. Even if they didn't know the Murdaugh, the sort of power that the Murdaugh family had over this part of low country in South Carolina is hard to explain, almost pretty difficult to comprehend. I think Gayane and I have gotten a sense of it, but they had a lot of money, they had a lot of power, and they had a lot of influence, not just recently, but for a century. And I want to add, to give context, Anne-Marie, and I think this really puts in perspective the power that they had. A Murdaugh has been solicitor in the area for nearly 100 years. That's essentially like the lead prosecutor for nearly a century. In the courtroom where Alec Murdaugh stood trial hung a picture of his great-grandfather, who was once the solicitor, which the judge ordered be removed before his trial began to try not to sway the jury. So that is the kind of power and influence historically that we're talking about.
Yeah. The evidence that actually reignited this case hasn't actually been made public by SLED. SLED is the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. Nikki, Gayane, what do we know then?
What we know is for years following Stephen's death, his mother, Sandy Smith, she really wanted a second opinion. His death was initially ruled a hit and run, and she just never bought that. And since the trial and conviction of Alec Murdaugh for the murders of his wife and son, Paul and Maggie, questions began circulating around the death of Stephen Smith. While investigating those murders of Paul and Maggie, SLED announced they found a new lead into Stephen's death. They have never said yet what that evidence was.
And I will add that, Sandy really didn't believe her son's death was accidental, but it's important to point out that even early on, the cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma, caused by a hit and run. But the manner of death, which is whether or not it was an accident or a murder, that was left undetermined. And, Sandy believed that there was foul play. She believed her son was murdered, and whoever did this should be held responsible.
I got to say, thank goodness for mothers. They push for further investigation. They basically become, investigators themselves until they get to the bottom of these cases. And this is a perfect example of that.
I was just going to add, Sandy Smith really is remarkable because she is a single mom. She doesn't have a lot of means. She'll be the first to tell you that. And she fought powerful people for a really long time. And I don't think her son's case would have had a second look, I'm sure, if it hadn't been for her. And I think people might be wondering, well, why would anyone want to hurt Stephen Smith? And if you ask Sandy Smith that question, which I did, she thought perhaps maybe it was because her son was gay. And we're talking about South Carolina low country, which most people tell you there is probably relatively conservative. Mm-hmm. And there was also Stephen's cell phone, which is now also with SLED. We don't know what evidence was found, but Sandy told us that about a week before Stephen died, Stephen was getting a lot of texts, and that Stephen had told her about going away with someone to Key West for a deep sea fishing trip.
Mm-hmm. In fact, let's listen to an interview that you did with Sandy Smith. Let's play some sound.
Do you know if anyone actually was able to read Stephen's text messages or see where he might have been based on cell phone evidence?
What I heard from the FBI agent, there was a lot of interesting information in the phone that needed to be looked at.
But she says that didn't prompt local or state authorities to pursue the case further.
There's something in that phone that nobody wants out there.
We should note that we most likely will not know what the new evidence SLED has. Even if an arrest is made, likely we'll learn what this evidence is if and when we do, if the case is ever brought to trial.
Why is that?
In this case, we got access to the original case file from 2015, but that's really the only place where we even see how this investigation was conducted. It seemed like, at least according to what was in the report, potential interviews that were not followed up on or people that they never got a hold of. And so I think SLED has really tried to keep everything very, very close to the vest. There's been so much public conversation and opinion and rumor around this case that they're really trying to, keep it really tightly sealed.
This must be so incredibly frustrating for Sandy, though.
So frustrating for her. But I think as we sit here and discuss this, she has perhaps more hope than she's ever had that she might just might get some answers. That's all she wants is answers and justice, though justice is a tricky word when you've lost a child, but she at least wants someone to be held responsible.
You spoke to Dr. Michelle Dupree, the pathologist who oversaw the latest autopsy on Stephen's remains in April of 2023. Would their new findings confirm Sandy's suspicions of what really happened to her son? We'll talk about the new report, the crime scene, and what's next in the investigation into Stephen Smith's death when we get back. Welcome back. Stephen's cause of death was actually initially thought to be from a gunshot wound at the scene of the crime, but then that was changed to a hit and run by the medical examiner. So here's a clip from retired South Carolina Highway Patrol Lieutenant Thomas Moore about his observations from the crime scene.
I was told that the medical examiner made that ruling, and I reached out to her. It became a little bit heated. Give me an answer medically that would lead you to believe he was hit by a car. There was no medical reason.
Did you see any signs of a hit and run?
No, ma'am, none. Any type of debris, any kind of glass, car parts, piece of plastic, anything that looks like it may be related to a vehicle.
It is such a confounding case. Something does not add up.
Stephen Smith's shoes were loosely tied. When his body was found, they were still on his feet. One thing that has struck several experts I've talked to in covering Stephen's case, you just wouldn't see that in a true hit and run because it just takes such little force, such little speed to knock someone's shoes off.
Lieutenant Moore said you would expect to find the clothes shredded, you would expect to find, and he's not a pathologist, obviously, but injuries in the legs where you would be hit by a car. And so, and he really felt that it looked staged because Stephen's body was also found 3 miles from where his car was found with the gas cap hanging open. So in his experience covering car crashes and hit and runs, that was something he had not seen. So the whole thing looked suspicious to him. It looked staged.
Because this was being investigated as a hit and run, it was under the Highway Patrol's jurisdiction, not the Hampton County Sheriff's Office or SLED. What kind of impact did that have on the case?
Lieutenant Moore with the Highway Patrol said he really felt like this case was pawned off on them. He believes the Murdaugh name was a deterrent in delving into the case and getting help from local authorities.
Tommy Moore said usually you would work together with the sheriff's department because it is a small community. And so they would typically get help. And in this case, he said, we physically tried to give them that case file and they wouldn't take it from us.
And to add to that on how the investigation was handled, since Stephen's death was ruled a hit and run initially, unfortunately, according to the Highway Patrol unit, a lot of the evidence initially collected has been lost because of how Stephen's death was ruled initially, which now obviously would be critical.
So we talked about this already, but there's an important person in the community who's sort of a through line through this broadcast. And of course, it's Stephen Smith's mother. These mothers are just absolute heroes. We heard from so many viewers and listeners who were really moved by Sandy. Can you talk to me about just what it was like to interview her? She is in pain, but she is steadfast in her goal to get justice for her son.
We sat down and talked on camera for a couple hours probably collectively, and Gayane and I spent many hours talking to her on the phone. And I know I said this to Sandy that I was just so struck by her strength. We're the three of us, we're moms, she's a mom, and there is nothing worse than losing a child, I can't imagine. And yet she, for at least 8 years, has fought for justice. She didn't have the means to hire a big, powerful lawyer, and she decided to create a GoFundMe page to gather donations. And it was with the help of those donations. And I think at one point it got up to, Gayane, remind me, at least over $80,000.
$130,000.
Wow. So that money allowed her to do this new investigation and exhume her son's body and see once and for all what may have happened to him, And not just that. I mean, Sandy had written a letter to the FBI trying to get the cell phone looked at. She just was vocal for years, trying to get anyone to look at her son's death.
What has that done to her, making that pain your purpose in life? Did she talk about that at all?
When Nikki asked Sandy about her resilience, Sandy kind of said, she didn't know until she was put in this position how much of a fighter she is. She feels like she has been and she has, in essence, been the lead investigator in her son's case. But, as far as being a grieving mother, she said, there's time for that. I can grieve later. First, I have to see this through. And so she's amazing. I mean, she is no shrinking violet. I mean, she's tough and she says it like it is. And she's really not afraid of what anyone thinks. So she's really an incredible force.
Yeah.
I'm getting the chills, Gayane, just hearing you recount some of what she said. And then I remembered as you were talking. So Anne-Marie, when we do our 48 hours, we go on CBS Mornings the Friday before it airs to talk about the hour. And I had text Sandy the night before I went on to talk about this case airing. And I said, is there anything you'd like me to say? She said, I just want to thank everyone who supported me and fight for my son. And I think that was her saying, while she may have a small support system at home, she has a massive support system, and all of the people that have reached out about Stephen's case, donated to the GoFundMe, and just taken an interest so that it gets the attention it deserves.
Yeah. And it's, in fact, because of Sandy's diligence, determination, eventually it led to Stephen being exhumed, which is not an easy thing for loved ones to have to witness. This happens nearly 8 years after Stephen Smith's death. A new autopsy was performed and revealed that he died from a single blow to his forehead, severely fracturing his skull. I want to play a clip of what Dr. Dupree says they didn't find during the autopsy.
We didn't find fractures of any part of the body except for the head. There was a little road rash, which you would expect.
Any signs of a struggle?
No.
Any signs of a beating?
No.
Any injuries below his head other than the road rash?
None whatsoever.
She says that eliminates the possibility Stephen was hit by a car head-on. Dupree says the findings also refute early theories that Stephen's body might have been staged.
Were you able to determine whether Stephen was struck and fell, or he might have been struck and then placed there?
We don't believe that he was placed there. We believe that whatever happened right there.
Dr. Dupree rules out some of the initial theories that suggested Stephen's death wasn't an accident. Nikki, Gayane, do you know how Sandy Smith reacted to these findings?
She was very careful in discussing the investigation. I think she's also very cognizant of the fact that, she doesn't want to hurt the progress that SLED is making, but they've shared their findings with SLED. However, Sandy did say, that she would be accepting. I mean, Nikki asked her various different scenarios of, what if they come back and say it was an accident? What if, this particular individual did it? And she says she would accept it as long as she felt like it was a thorough investigation. But in her heart, she feels her son was murdered.
Yeah. Well, I think, for many people, you look at the crime scene and you go, something just doesn't make sense here. It doesn't make sense. Crime scene expert Dr. Kenny Kinsey re-examined Stephen's case with Dr. Dupree, and he was also a star witness for the prosecution in the Alex Murdaugh trial. What did the crime scene reveal?
So we went with Dr. Kinsey to the crime scene, and we looked at photos from the crime scene. He actually got on the ground on the very spot where Stephen was found on the road to explain to us what he thought. Dr. Kinsey said Stephen was most likely killed in the spot his body was found because of the massive amount of blood found next to Stephen's body. You see a pool of blood in the photos. Dr. Kinsey's exact words to me were that he believes that this was an atypical hit and run, meaning he doesn't believe that a car struck Stephen. He believes that a car was driving and something was sticking out, and that object struck Stephen, and that's what killed him. That was the fatal blow, and Dr. Kinsey's theory, he says, would explain why there aren't other marks on his body, why there weren't broken bones.
The big mystery at the center of this case, though, is whether or not this was an accident or whether it was intentional. Do you know, will we ever find out the answer to that question, accident or deliberate?
I think that's sort of the $1 million question. And, Dr. Dupree and Dr. Kinsey, who shared their findings with us, have answered the question of how Stephen died, but they can't really answer the why or the who. Apparently, they do have some names. According to Sandy's attorney, they had a handful of people that they were looking at. Subpoenas and warrants were being issued, to gather more information by the investigative grand jury that was impaneled. But it's been so many years, and because of the fact that, maybe critical evidence wasn't gathered at the time, maybe certain things weren't followed up on that should have been, they are counting on someone to come forward and to finally, admit what they know, whether they were involved or if they have firsthand knowledge of someone who was involved.
So then does that mean, at least for now, this case is at a standstill, or can we expect anything more in the investigation in the coming months?
We were told by multiple people on the record, including Sandy's lawyers, that a grand jury had been impaneled over this summer. So Sandy's hope, and the hope of family of Stephen Smith and the new lawyers working with Sandy, is that there might be an arrest soon. And I think that Sandy believes there will be an arrest, but we just don't know what will happen next, or if and when.
What a excruciating wait for her and everyone else who loved Stephen. Whatever happens, I know you guys will be following this case. I will be following this case. We're going to keep our eyes, our ears open for what comes next. Nikki, Gayane, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Be sure to join us next Tuesday for another postmortem, and watch 48 Hours, Saturdays, 10, 9 Central on CBS and streaming on Paramount+. And if you are liking the show, please rate and review 48 Hours on Apple Podcasts and follow 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen ad-free on the Amazon Music and Wondery app, or with a 48 Hours Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts.